Welcome everybody to this Radboud Reflects program on poverty. Is there someone to blame? My name is Mark Sloors. I'm stepping in for Noord Flemings, who is actually supposed to present this program. My function is limited to introducing the speakers and to interviewing them a bit, and then they can discuss things amongst themselves. Our first speaker is philosopher Jeanette Kennett from Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia. She's in the philosophical world, she's a very well-known philosopher working on moral responsibility, legal responsibility, and a lot of other things that I shall not mention. And she'll be giving a talk about 40 minutes long on poverty and on the question. We sort of have the tendency to think that people who are poor mainly got themselves to blame. And there might be something wrong with that assumption. And Jeanette is going to tell us what is wrong with that assumption. After that, the talk will be approximately 40 minutes. After that, we'll have a discussion between János Betkó from our own university, now at the Faculty of Management Sciences, but he just defended his PhD thesis 2 months ago, on a very interesting experiment, social experiment on poverty and welfare, which was conducted here in Nijmegen, and it connects really nicely with the talk that Jeanette will give. We'll have a conversation approximately half an hour, maybe a little bit less, and then we'll have at least 15 minutes for questions from the audience. That is from you. So that's the program, and Jeanette, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here tonight on this topic. Okay, so I have slides, and I have put quite a bit of text on them because I thought maybe it would be easier for you if you had sort of both the words and the written word as well. But you don't need to look at them. Okay, so first of all, I want to run through some very well-known myths, let's say, about poor people that are very widespread in, I think, certainly my country, all the Anglophone countries, but I suspect, you would find echoes of these myths about poor people in your own country, especially people who are receiving government support, receiving welfare benefits. So they are lazy, they just don't want to work, they're addicted to drink and drugs, they're not really poor, they just don't manage their money properly, they're on the fiddle, that means they're milking the system, and they have an easy life on benefits. Now, there's nothing really new about these myths. They've been around for a very long time. George Orwell, when he came back from Burma in the 1920s, he said the middle classes were still talking about lazy, idle loafers on the dole and saying that these men could all find work if they wanted to. And that was the attitude towards unemployment in those days. It was a disaster which happened to you as an individual and for which you were to blame. So, how should we think about these issues? Or that's my question to myself as a philosopher, how should I think about these issues? Because philosophers have talked about poverty, but it's been talked about under the guise of political philosophy, and it's really been thought about as an issue of how developed countries should behave towards developing countries, poor third world countries. So what do we owe to the global poor? But I got interested in what it's like to be poor in our kinds of societies, wealthy societies, educated societies, with large middle classes. but where there is still significant inequality. And I wanted to explore what it means for the people who live in poverty in a rich society and what poverty does to them, how it affects their, and I'll use a philosophical term here, their agency, that is, the ways in which they can control their lives and act upon the world. So I'm going to put this talk into two parts. First of all, I want to look at what I think of as punitive policies directed towards poor people, and I'll be drawing mainly on the Australian experience, but I think that once we talk with János, we'll find that there's quite a few commonalities. And so I'll draw on work in philosophy on punishment, its nature and its justification. And I want to ask the question is, does the punishment, as it were, that we impose on people who need public assistance fit the crime of poverty? Then I want to move on to consider the myths about the sort of character and failings and shortcomings, supposed shortcomings of people who live in poverty, and investigate the issue of self-control. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what self-control is, how it's exercised, why it's valuable, and then I'm going to explore the social conditions which support or undermine people's capacities to control their own lives. Okay, so that's what we'll do. So, first of all, poverty, self-control and welfare. Now, if poverty is seen as a result of moral failings, in particular a culpable lack of self-control, of capacity to look after your money properly, to plan, to, go without in order to get something more worthwhile in the future, if it's a lack of self-control, then the person is to blame for their poverty. And so the conclusion goes, if poverty is a result of chosen behaviour, then any assistance that the state provides to the poor is conditional, or should be conditional, on them meeting certain requirements, behaving in certain ways. Oops, what happened there? Good. Okay, so this is the Australian experience. I don't know if you recognise that man up there. He was our Prime Minister until last year, but this was when he was Minister for Social Services. So he was the Minister in charge of the public assistance programs in Australia. And just after he became Social Services Minister, this was basically a headline in one of the major Sydney newspaper. New Social Services Minister Scott Morrison has issued a warning to would-be dole bludgers. You're going to learn some Australian slang here. A dole bludger is, a lazy kind of person who lies around enjoying whatever while other people work hard. Disability support pension rorters, they're people who are actively cheating the system. Maybe they're not really disabled. And even terrorists who want to wage war while on government benefits. So that's fairly emotive language, and it's designed to whip people up into thinking, yeah, we need to crack down. And so Mr. Morrison then announced that we were going to have a tough new welfare cop on the beat. So obviously this introduces the idea that the poor and anybody who's getting government benefits needs to be policed. So we can see that the institutional response to unemployment, to illness, to disability support is going to be targeted at the management and control of the individual who is receiving the benefits. Now, systems that are assuming poor character, that you're a dole bludger, that you're a rorter, that you're a terrorist, will be built on a lack of trust, and they're going to prioritise avoidance of fraud via extensive monitoring, tough sanctions, and debt recovery. And indeed, this is what happens. Now, if you are in Australia and you are on unemployment benefits, these are the things that you need to do to keep getting your payment. You have to agree to a job plan. I mean, you get sent to a private job employment service and you get assigned a case manager, and those people are paid, those companies are paid quite a lot of money to do this work, to help you get a job. So you have to meet the requirements of your plan, you have to go to appointments with your provider, you have to complete and report job searches, you have to earn 100 points a month, and you get points for various things, including applying for jobs and doing little courses. And, you know, if you're old enough, if you're over 57 or something, you're allowed to get some of those points for volunteering. And you have to accept any offer of suitable paid work, and you have to not leave a job, training course or program without a valid reason. And if you don't meet your requirements, demerits and financial penalties may apply. And indeed, hundreds of thousands of people every year have their payments suspended or cancelled because they, didn't meet a requirement. Now, what's the experience of these surveillance and compliance measures on the individuals who are subject to them? Well, they find it pretty humiliating. The first quote is from an article in The Guardian. It's a special kind of shame when you realise how powerless you are in a room where the other person can remove your only source of money. The system we're forced into is a system of relentless bowing and humiliation. And then the next was from a submission made to a parliamentary inquiry into the way in which these systems are governed. The stress associated with being constantly under threat by the whims of a particular person, system faults, or even a missed phone call are immeasurable. It affects our physical and emotional health, our ability to participate in our communities, our sense of future, and diminishes our self-worth and our accomplishments while keeping us in poverty. So that was sort of to set the scene. This is what the system is like in Australia. I know it is like that in the United Kingdom, and I know it's something like that here. Now, what I've described is a system that the participants always describe as punitive. They feel like they are being punished. Okay, so turning to philosophical work on punishment, what do philosophers have to say? What is punishment? Are they actually being punished? So Anthony Duff, a very distinguished philosopher of law, says that punishment involves the imposition of treatment which is intentionally unwelcome, burdensome or harsh in response to action or actions undertaken by the target for which the target is thought to be blameworthy. Joel Feinberg, another legal philosopher, says that punishment is a conventional device for the expression of attitudes of resentment and indignation and of judgments of disapproval and reprobation on either the part of the punishing authority themselves or of those in whose name the punishment is inflicted. Punishment has a symbolic significance. So what he means here is that the symbolic significance of punishment just is the expression of the moral reprobation, the disapproval of the person who is being punished. That's the symbolic significance. But it also does, as Duff points out, involve treatment which is unwelcome, burdensome and harsh. So you're getting both. You're getting moral disapproval and you're getting actual penalties. And Duff also says an essential part of punishment's meaning and justification lies in relation to moral blame. So if the social security system is punitive, then, we will find these elements of moral blame in there. And I would suggest that all of those poverty myths that we looked at have all got this element of moral blame going on. So how do we justify punishment? Because punishment does need to be justified. Punishment, because it involves the intentional infliction of suffering or deprivation, it carries a heavy justificatory burden particularly when carried out by the state, because there's just a vast imbalance of power between the state and its instrumentalities and the individual. So the state actually bears a heavy burden. They need to discharge a heavy burden of justification. They don't, but they need to. Now, punishment, I think we'd all agree, at a minimum has to be deserved, right? And there are some questions that we need to answer about punishment. Who may we properly punish? What principles or goals should determine the allocation of punishments, and who should determine it? And how should the appropriate amount of punishment be determined? Those are all good questions, and unfortunately when we look at the welfare system there aren't really very many good answers. But here's some general justifications that you might offer for a punitive welfare system, a welfare system that assumes that people are trying to cheat and so therefore closely monitors them. Well, you might have consequentialist justifications, and those are justifications which say, look, if we behave in this way, it will have better outcomes. Sure, it might not be very nice, but it will be justified in terms of some good outcomes. What are those good outcomes? Well, paralleling the kinds of defences that are offered for criminal punishment, consequentialist justifications for criminal punishment, community protection. Well, in this context, it would be protection of taxpayer funding by targeting and compliance measures. You know, we're not just throwing your money away, your hard-working taxpayer money away on people. You can be assured that only people who deserve it are getting it. Then, if we have a punitive system, it will have some deterrence built in, both individual and general. The threat of penalties acts as a deterrence against cheating and motivates, or is supposed to motivate, active engagement with job programs and promote work seeking. And that will help people get a job, and that'll be good for them, that'll be a great outcome, right? And then there's rehabilitation, because here you are, you don't have a job, you're a bit of a bludger, but, you know, these measures are going to promote personal responsibility, they're going to encourage you to take more control of your life, develop life management skills and so forth. So those would be the consequentialist justifications. And if there were any evidence that these sorts of punitive measures had these effects, maybe we could say, yeah, okay, well, the system works. But unfortunately, and I think János will back me up here, there is no evidence that these punitive systems have any of these good effects, okay? So those are sort of forward-looking justifications for punishing people. They're looking at bringing about good consequences in the future. But if the forward-looking justifications aren't there, then we're going to have backward-looking justifications. And the position in philosophy known as retributivism is focused on the person and the acts for which they are considered blameworthy. So what are the justifications for sanctions here? Well, it will have to be something like the person's actions in not showing up for an appointment or not applying for enough jobs, say, or missing a phone call or lots of different things. The person's actions violate a fair principle of mutual obligation and so merit punishments and moral condemnation. So the fair principle of mutual obligation is, well, we give you an income and in return you have to undertake all of these activities to be worthy of that income, okay? You haven't done that, so you merit punishment. And you could also see the sanctions imposed as a sort of a repayment of the moral debt to the community that's going to restore balance and fairness between the taxpayers who are handing out the money and the people who are receiving it. However, even if you're kind of convinced by this, and there might be societies under which, you know, there's a fair principle of mutual obligation in play, that would have to be, you know, perhaps a society where, you know, the level of payments wasn't way, way, way below the poverty line the way it is in Australia, but ours are indeed the lowest in the OECD, so, you know. there might be societies that get closer to that principle. However, even if you've got a fair principle of mutual obligation, notice that the punishment has to be fair, the punishment itself, so the penalty, proportionate and deserved. Now, in these systems, how is punishment determined and by whom? Well, usually it's determined either just by an algorithm. You didn't report in time, you didn't report online in time, so your payment is stopped until you meet that requirement. Or it's decided by a caseworker at a job agency, and alas, in Australia, those caseworkers, there's no minimum standard. They don't have any training in particular, apart from what the private agency cares to give them. And, quite rightly, a lot of people find the process very arbitrary. There isn't actually a process. They just do it to you. You can appeal, but of course that takes a long time, and in the meantime you have no income. And also, while you have no income, you are still required to apply for jobs and do all the other things that will get you back in the good books. So the process doesn't seem to be particularly fair or particularly transparent. And this is even more of a problem when you think about the proportionality. Does the punishment fit the crime? Is it proportional to the offence? And there I think we see the sort of worst excesses of the system, because when people's payments are stopped, they have no money and they can't buy food and they can't pay rent. And they can't, people literally become homeless and go hungry. So you have to ask, are hunger, malnutrition, loss of housing, and certainly effective exclusion from participation in society, are these reasonable and proportionate responses to offences such as failing to submit a form on time, missing an appointment, or not applying for enough jobs? And you also have to think, who's being punished? Well, often it's not just the person who's receiving the benefit. A lot of these people will have children, dependent children, who will also go hungry, who are also at risk of homelessness, whose parents can't afford to take them to the doctor, and all sorts of things. And I think we know the answer to the question of whether it's okay to punish children for the sins of the parent. So I really think this fails the proportionality test, even if you think that, there is some principle of mutual obligation that might be fair. Okay, so that's the punishment thing. Now, there is one view that I just want to mention before I move on to talking about self-control, and that's luck egalitarianism, because I think the luck egalitarian of a particular stripe might try and carve a distinction between deserving and undeserving poor people in this way. Luck egalitarians think that inequalities that warrant compensation are those resulting from factors that individuals have no choice about. That's so-called brute luck. If you are poor and needing assistance because of bad sort of brute luck, then society, a decent society, owes you some compensation. However, if there are inequalities resulting from freely chosen behaviour, such as lifestyle choices or risky behaviour, and this is called option luck, then those don't warrant compensation. So we actually don't owe you an income, and if we don't owe you an income, then whatever we do give is a kind of charity, and we can demand what we like in return. So on the luck egalitarian view, if people's situation arises from option luck, from poor choices, then withholding their income doesn't count as punitive because we had no obligation to give them an income in the first place. So this brings us back to the idea that poverty largely arises from voluntary behaviour and poor choices that people make. And that's what I'm going to look at here. What's the defect? That people are supposed to suffer from, and the one that is often brought up is lack of self-control. Okay, so a very common way in which self-control is talked about in psychology is in terms of delayed gratification. So we can be in a situation where we have an immediate reward available to us, but if we forego the immediate reward, we'll get a larger one a little way or maybe a long way into the future. So the idea is that the presence of smaller, sooner rewards places a person in a situation of conflict and requires the exercise of self-control to overcome the temptation, put aside that smaller, sooner reward and achieve the bigger reward later. And there was a famous set of experiments run by Walter Mischel quite some time ago that seemed to back this up, that seemed to back up this idea that the capacity to delay gratification was really critical to life success. So for those of you who don't know, they got a bunch of young children, they were about 4 years old, I think, and they would take them into the room and the experimenter would show them, put a marshmallow in front of them, and they would explain to the child that the experimenter had to go out of the room for a bit, and that if the marshmallow was still there on the table when they got back, the child would get 2 marshmallows. So 1 marshmallow now versus 2 marshmallows later, okay? And then they would leave the room and obviously film the kid and things like that. And the children, some of the kids just sort of grabbed and others sort of went up close and sniffed it. One kid even licked it, didn't eat it. And other kids, very successful kids, they would do a little dance or sing a song or turn their back on the marshmallow and manage to wait for the experimenter to come back. And they followed up these kids, and the experiments seemed to show that the capacity to delay at this early age was very predictive of life success, of, staying in school, not using drugs as a teenager and all the rest of it. So it seemed, it sort of brought about this, acceptance that doing well as an adult relies on the development and maintenance of self-regulatory capacities, and that seems a very appealing kind of view, a very kind of natural view to have. But we will come back to the marshmallow experiments. I want to say, so what is it that self-control is supposed to deliver us? This capacity to focus more on the future and plan for the future and not be distracted by momentary temptations. Well, it seems to allow us to sort of to achieve certain kinds of goods that require attention over a long period of time. So synchronic goods are now goods. Diachronic goods are sort of long-term goods. So long-term goods are things like careers, completing a degree, building a house, saving up for that dream holiday, all sorts of things like that. And these things we might call diachronic or long-term goods, and the diachronic goods come to people who are successfully able to engage in longer-term projects, occupy meaningful roles, and participate in close relationships. And these are the kinds of things that seem to confer meaning, structure, and social recognition on us. They contribute to mental health and well-being, and they also, I'm going to suggest, scaffold and support further exercises of self-control. Having these sorts of good things puts you in a better place to exercise self-control over time. But what does poverty do? Well, when you read the accounts of people who live in poverty and experience poverty over a period of time, you really do see a loss of hope and a sense of hopelessness about the future. as Orwell said, you can't settle to anything. You can't command the spirit of hope with that evil, dull cloud hanging over you. So what is required for rational hope? That's, hope that isn't just mere wishful thinking or fantasy. Well, I think that there are two conditions in having hope for our future and having a hopeful attitude towards our future. One is the possibility condition. We have to believe that we have the power to act upon the world so as to bring it about, that the holiday, the study, the fitness plan, the house purchase happens roughly according to plan. We've got to have confidence that the steps we take will lead to the outcome that we want. And this is related but not exactly the same. It's the identity condition. We have to feel that the envisioned future is mine. I have to be able to see myself in this nice future. You see, I might have a set of values. I might know exactly what kind of life I think would be a good life and I would like to have. But if I can't picture me, if it doesn't feel like me, then that is going to be a problem. I've done quite a lot of work on addiction and have done studies with people with addiction. And this is what they often describe. They just sort of can't believe in that future where they have all these good things and they're sober because it just doesn't feel like them. It's sort of an identity across time thing that is really bothering. Now, I think when both of these conditions, in order for both of these conditions to be met, they do depend upon an assumption that the environment that we're in is relatively benign, okay? You've got to have reason to think that these things can come about. And you've got to have what I would call a sense of moral security. So what's moral security? Well, it involves the belief that our interests and our welfare are regarded as morally important by the social, the political and the legal institutions in our society. So that's going to require recognition of our basic physical needs and welfare, recognition of our status as moral agents with our own values and our own conception of the good, and recognition of the authority of our testimony, of what we say regarding our needs, experiences and welfare. And if we have moral security, then that engenders things like emotional stability, self-esteem, confidence, the courage to attempt things, to try things. And yes, and you can perhaps think about to what extent people who live in poverty have this sense of moral security. Now, if we don't have moral security, if moral security is denied to us, then we are injured. And we are injured in our capacity to act. We are injured in our capacity to direct our own lives. For many poor people, the attitudes, it's a stigmatised condition, like other stigmatised conditions. And if you're poor, you're often seen as having no entitlement to the goods that we ordinarily hold as central to a fulfilling life. You don't have an entitlement to recreation or holidays. You don't have an entitlement to play. You don't have an entitlement to fun, fulfilling work. You don't even have, parenthood is supposed to be one of the central human goods. Having children is supposed to be wonderful. But if you're poor, it's really frowned upon. You shouldn't have kids if you're poor. That's just more trying to take advantage of the state. So you're not even allowed that. And I've spent the last year following quite a few people who live in poverty on Twitter, some of them poverty activists, some of them who are just people who are poor and describe their experiences. And I've got to say that the degree of scrutiny and criticism of their lives by more privileged people is quite something. If they mention having a smartphone, you can't really be poor if you've got a smartphone. and people have to say, oh, well, my brother gave me his old one or something like that. And even to point out that they have to have a smartphone because they have to, fill in forms and submit them online, and they have to be available, they have to send off job applications and stuff like that. They need access to the computer, they need access to the web, they're actually required to have it. But you'll get so many criticisms of that and of what they eat. Food shaming is incredibly common. Woe betide any poor person who puts a photo up of the sort of pathetic amount of food that they could buy with their weekly allowance or what they're down to, if it includes anything sweet, any biscuits or chocolate, even tea and coffee. There'll be people criticising them for not meeting their own personal high standards of thrift and nutrition. Now, all of this really does lead to an attitude of hopeless and resignation, because if a possible future is not for me or it's not for the likes of me, you won't be motivated to exercise self-control. You won't be motivated to forego those smaller, sooner rewards. As the philosopher Cheshire Calhoun says, when exercising one's agency has ceased to be reliably connected to producing intended effects, deliberation may well seem pointless and the future hopeless. Okay, so let's go back to the marshmallows. The original marshmallow experiment was carried out at Stanford University, and the children were children of Stanford employees. So, not exactly a socially diverse group of children. And the marshmallow experiments have been repeated by a few different groups, and the consensus appears to be that it's affluence, not willpower, that seems to be what's behind some kids' capacity to delay gratification. That once you allow for socioeconomic status, it turns out that the poor kids who could delay didn't do any better than the poor kids who couldn't delay, and the rich kids who couldn't delay didn't do any worse than the rich kids who could delay. So what made the difference really was parental level of education and socioeconomic status. That's what made the difference to life success, not this capacity to delay. However, what we see with people who are poor is that given that the long-term goods are not for them, given them that they can't really see a pathway to achieving those goods, they will refocus on the synchronic goods. As one of these studies said, poorer parents try to indulge their kids when they can. Hair dye and sweet treats might seem frivolous, but purchases like these are often the only indulgences poor families can afford. And for poor children, indulging in a small bit of joy today can make life feel more bearable, especially when there's no guarantee of more joy tomorrow. When Orwell wrote The Road to Wigan Pier, he spent some time in mining towns, very poor communities. He said he saw the same thing. He said, when you are underfed, harassed, bored and miserable, you don't want to eat dull, wholesome food. There's always something cheaply pleasant to tempt you. That's how the mind works. And that's what we would do too. Linda Tirado, an American poverty activist who wrote a blog post on poverty that went viral, says, I make a lot of poor financial decisions. None of them matter in the long term. I'll never not be poor. So what does it matter if I don't pay a thing and a half this week instead of just one thing? It's not like the sacrifice will it result in improved circumstances. The thing holding me back isn't that I blow $5 at Wendy's. It's not worth it to me to live a bleak life devoid of small pleasures so that one day I can make a single large purchase. I will never have large pleasures to hold on to. Now, if that's your mindset, it's rational to do what Tirado does. Now let's think about us. I'm assuming that most people in this room aren't going short of food. If you are, I'm sorry, don't mean to be making a joke of this at all. But I just want to point out that there's a real privilege to the exercise of self-control. And I want to point out that when people like me forego a smaller, sooner reward for something larger later, like if I have to give up an evening at the pub with my friends so that I can stay home and finish a talk that I'm giving the next day, that looks like, giving up the smaller, sooner, the fun evening. But I'm not giving up everything. What I'm going to do usually is substitute in other smaller, sooner rewards. I have to spend the evening marking essays. I'd better get some chocolates in, to keep me going. I need them to get through this big essay marking thing. And I'm probably going to need, I don't drink coffee, but tea. And then maybe when I really reach the end of the road, I'll pour myself a glass of wine. So I'm not actually going without rewards here, am I? This is not Olympic level self-denial. So that's self-control as exercised by me. It's not really demanding very much of me. And it's also enacted from a very high baseline of comfort and moral security. I have got these, I have got a reasonably respected social role, at least in some quarters. I'm warm, I'm well fed, I've got an education, I've got a nice house, I've got social support, I've got a reasonable degree of confidence. I can afford to take a few risks, and if something doesn't work out, there'll be alternatives. So really, what am I congratulating myself for when I say, I've worked hard for this? You often hear rich people say, I've worked hard for what I've got. And they probably have, but it was a lot easier for them to work hard, and they're not necessarily working harder than the person who has to clean 35 hotel rooms in a day, for example. They're just, doing it from a higher base. So that's us, and we exercise self-control from a position of privilege, and we use the resources our privilege gives us to reach our long-term goals. But I want to say that the resort to smaller, sooner rewards by people living in poverty is not actually a lack of self-control. Often it's self-management. These are self-management strategies. So Linda Tirado again says, I smoke. It's expensive. It's also the best option. You see, I'm always exhausted. It's a stimulant. When I'm too tired to walk one more step, I can smoke and go for another hour. When I'm enraged and beaten down and incapable of accomplishing one more thing, I can smoke and feel a little better just for a minute. It's the only relaxation I'm allowed. It's not a good decision, but it's the only one that I have access to. So Tirado is using smoking to get through a shift at her low-paid casual job after she's, done a whole lot, discharged a whole lot of other obligations, and she's using that the way I'm using chocolates to get through, a heavy marking session. No one's condemning me for having a chocolate every 2 essays, but, she's smoking, it's unhealthy, so she's going to be a burden on the health system, and 2, it's expensive, she could spend her money better on nutritious food, blah, blah, blah. And there's no recognition of the sort of low baseline of moral security, comfort and energy that she has to live with. And the way that it is viewed and interpreted just goes to reinforce those poverty myths that I began with. Okay, so reaching the end, when moral security is lost through poverty, people learn that they can't control their lives in accordance with their conception of what is a good life. And they might blame themselves for being unable to secure the sort of long-term diachronic goods that society has assured them are available to everyone who merits them. And in those circumstances, they may give up on deliberating, planning and acting on the basis of long-term goals, and their agency does to some extent contract because their choice situation is reduced. And so it might be rational for them to go for the smaller, sooner rewards over the larger, later ones that they often quite accurately judge are unlikely ever to arrive. Unfortunately, this is characterised by others as blameworthy, lack of self-control, and something that we're entitled to sanction and punish them for. So I think that an examination of the reality of poverty should make us question theories of self-control which see self-control as an individual achievement dependent upon and characterised in terms of internal features of the person and reflective of their essential moral character. And I hope that it would lead to a recognition that the strategies people develop and adopt to manage their lives are reflective of the options that they have, and that the options people have is very often a matter of brute luck and social privilege or lack of privilege. And that's the end. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeanette. That was that was very interesting. It was a bit depressing, but it was also extremely interesting talk. So, which mainly consisted of two parts. One on the conditionality of welfare and the detrimental effects that it has, and one on self-control. But I'd like to start with the first topic first, and introduce János Betkó, who is connected with our university, but who also works at the municipality of Nijmegen, and got to do research on exactly this conditionality of welfare and the effects on people's well-being in Nijmegen. And it was a really special story to hear about your research and how that came about and how your PhD came about. Can you tell a little bit about that story, how that came about?
I will try shortly. Our municipality, our city council, wanted to experiment with social assistance. We had a new social assistance law in 2015, which was rather strict and harsh and really comparable to the things you've shown us about the system in Australia. And the municipality was, on average, not pleased with it, and they wanted to experiment with a more unconditional form of social assistance, where people were allowed to earn a little bit money and keep it, which is normally not possible, where they had less restrictions, and more unconditional system, which more was based on trust in the people on social assistance, and less on the government telling them what they should do and fining them if they do not. Our municipality started with this experiment. I was the policy advisor, project leader at that time. And one of the requirements for both city council as the Ministry of Social Affairs was that such an experiment was researched academically so that the results were really usable and valid. And that's how the experiment started. As a project manager, I made the connection here with the university, with the sociology department. And in the end, it turned out that the cheapest way to do this research was to have a civil servant doing the research as an external PhD. And in the end, I decided to do it myself. And it was both budget-wise a smart decision and helped me pass the past 5 years.
Yeah. and this is the result of that research. And János brought a couple of those to just hand out to people who are interested. And they're upstairs somewhere on a table. So if you're interested, you can just simply take one.
Yeah, grab one.
Because the university paid for them, was his reasoning. Okay. So would you like to respond to Jeanette's a talk, and to what extent does that talk reflect what you found in your research?
Yeah, the very short reaction would be amen. It was really a very recognizable story, both on the system. I mean, the list of requirements were people which required of people is comparable to how the system is here, and also the rhetoric. Unfortunately, resembles. Well, at least from some political parties, large political parties in the countries, and a lot of people, how they look at people on social assistance. I made a few notes on a few topics where I thought it would be interesting. When you talked about denial of recognition and security, it's not just that people are not allowed to or are not able to do fun things. Which strikes me is that the system does not allow people to do smart things financial-wise. Yes. I mean, when I make a really stupid financial decision, I go to the casino with all my savings and I blow it away. Then I have options. I can rent one of my rooms to a student, and I have some extra money. I can do some volunteering work, and I get a small compensation for it. I can work extra hours. But when you're on social assistance, you're not allowed to do any volunteering. You need permission. When you rent one of your rooms, the government will say, okay, but then you need less money from the allowance, so we'll give you less money. When you sell your old second-handed stuff, you have to tell the government you did, and you will get that much less allowance. And at the same time, if somebody does not know these rules, and you already want to make your situation better, you sell your old second-hand stuff on the internet, and some civil servant finds out who is in charge with the controls, you'll get a fine. They will say you're a fraud. And, well, then we come back to the punishment part of your talk about the proportionality. This really is not proportional. The rules are really complicated, but we expect people to know and understand them, while we know that the people on social assistance, on average, are not very highly educated. Some have problems with literacy, some don't even speak the language at all. But we expect them to know everything, and if they make a mistake, fraud. And when we compare the fines we have for social assistance fraud with criminal penalties for real criminal behaviors, it's amazing that the fines for social assistance frauds can be much, much higher. When somebody makes a mistake in applying for an allowance which they are not entitled to. What the government does when they find out is how many years did somebody get the allowance when they were not entitled to it. If that's 5 years, you have to pay back 5 years' worth of allowance and double that as a fine. That's about 10,000 of euros. You will never be able to pay that back when you're on a minimum. And when you translate it to the criminal system, you have to do some really serious things to get a fine of 20,000, 30,000 euros. So also there, the proportionality is really hard to see. Maybe one last thing about this. The way the government is allowed to investigate social assistance fraud. It's really easy for the local government, if they suspect somebody of social assistance fraud, to follow them, to follow their car, to walk into their house. What happens quite a lot, because one of the most common frauds is that people are living together without having said to the government they are living together, because then the norm will get a little bit lower, you get a little bit less money. You can enter somebody's house, you can go through their stuff, you can count how much underwear is there and how many toothbrushes are there to see if there are actually 2 people living there. Normally, for criminal investigations, you have much more protection. The police can't follow you around without really substantial evidence already. So also there, the proportionality is very hard to see. I think that would be a first reaction.
Yeah.
And the response is basically, you agree on this.
Yeah.
There's not much to disagree. So maybe it's interesting to go one step back and just... So, Jeanette, I thought that in your talk, there were 2 types of punishments at play. The punishment of not complying with whatever is required of you to receive welfare, that's one. But the other one is the conditionality itself. It's not really punishment, but it's much more subtle, but it feels degrading to people. right?
Yeah, so even if you're meeting all the requirements, so you're not getting fined or losing income, people find it humiliating and degrading to have to, be subject often to somebody sort of much younger and more junior than themselves. There's one of the biggest growing groups of homeless people in Australia is women over the age of 50 who have presumably had a relationship break down, and they may have lost their job for various reasons, or ageism plus sexism, and they become very poor. And for them, it's to suddenly be plunged into this is deeply, deeply humiliating. To have somebody, tell you off because you missed a phone call from them and didn't make an appointment. I mean, and people have been punished for not making an appointment, for not coming to an appointment, even when they have had really good excuses. One of the submissions to the parliamentary inquiry said that her daughter had a life-threatening illness. She was in hospital with her daughter all night, and she rang her job agency and said, look, I can't make the appointment, my daughter's in hospital. An excuse that would in any other context just be accepted, right? And she was told, well, you're not your daughter's official carer, she doesn't have a disability, so you have to come to the appointment, and if you don't, if you don't come, you will be breached, which means you'll you'll have your payments suspended. Somebody else, because of COVID, her new glasses were delayed, and she rang her job agency and said to the person, her case manager, look, I can't come in because my glasses haven't arrived, I can't read and I can't drive, I can't see to drive, and it's probably a requirement on her licence that she wears her glasses. And, the job service provider suggested she get a taxi or something, which is obviously unaffordable, and said she still had to come in or she would lose her payment. So she drove there unsafely, and when she gets there, the person says, I haven't had time to go through your resume or any of these other things. And she said the appointment lasted 3 minutes and out the door, and no help given. So these kinds of experiences, even if you're not being punished as such by being cut off your benefits, it feels very punitive. It feels, you're subject to very kind of punitive oversight. Every move is scrutinised. You've got to account for everything. The sort of relationship reporting and all of those sorts of things. And, in Australia, you're allowed to earn a small amount of money before your benefits are cut, but then they're cut at the rate of $1 for every 2 that you earn. So you're effectively paying a higher tax than anyone else. The highest tax bracket in Australia is 47 cents in the dollar. But if you're on benefits, as soon as you earn above $150 a fortnight, you're paying 50%, as it were. So it's a real poverty trap. It's very hard even to get out of it by having a job, because at those margins you're paying so much, you're losing so much in benefits and gaining so little in income that it's
very recognised. It's better in Australia than with us. We keep 75% for the first 6 months, and then we keep 100%.
Right.
So you're not allowed to keep everything. We tell to people you have to work, and even if it's a small job, you have to work. Yeah. And if they do the small job, they earn zero, nothing.
Right. So they get yes, okay.
But that's the financial trap, so to speak.
Yes.
But there is also the psychological trap that you sort of elaborated on. Maybe I can ask János first, because you researched the difference between conditional welfare and unconditional welfare. And can you say a little bit about how that affected people's well-being and the results of your research on that?
Yeah, when in relation to what you said, people experience it as very degrading, and that's what we had two conditions, two experimental conditions, which we compared to a control group on normal, regular Participation Act regime. One of those conditions, we just skipped every reintegration obligation and allowed them to earn much money. It's just, okay, people, you probably know better how to find a job, get out of social assistance by yourself than by some civil servant telling you how to do it. So go ahead, good luck, we'll see you back in 2 years. Or maybe not if you left social assistance. The second group also got a much more unconditional regime. They could strive for any goal they chose for. They could aim for volunteering, they could aim for part-time work, for self-employment, for a normal full-time job in any sector they want. The only condition was they had to have regular group coaching. So they had autonomy in how and what to do, only the coaching was mandatory. And the interesting thing was we started that group coaching sessions with the person, not with, here are a bunch of possible jobs, go write letters. But okay, how are you? How are you feeling? What do you need from us to be able to get your stuff in order? And what do you want out of life? And it was, that used to be part of the system. That used to be normal a few decades ago, that you started a conversation with that, but it got much more directed in a way that it was only focused on work. Well, the results of the experiment, in general, we looked at lots of outcomes on health, participation, work, self-confidence. Overall, between the two experimental conditions and the control condition, there were no really large differences. So you can say, okay, it doesn't matter that much, so maybe the experiment even failed. But at the same time, you can say, okay, all the threats and the punitive measures and the requirements and the bureaucracy involved with those are not really necessary. Because if you treat people with some trust and give them some space and treat them with some dignity, the results will be exactly the same. So even on that level, you can say that there's no empirical base for the harshness of the system. But then we went one step further and we looked not only at, what does it do at what happens at the treatment level, but also what happens for specific subgroups based on personal characteristics in the different treatments. So we looked, for example, what does it do with people with a migrant background, elderly people versus younger people, high educated versus lower educated, people with a lot of self-confidence versus no self-confidence, bad mental health versus better mental health. And when we did those analyses, we found that almost every significant result we found was the weaker groups, the more disadvantaged groups, performing better in the more unconditional systems on health and participation. Think volunteering, informal care, etc. When you put more disadvantaged people in the unconditional regimes, they perform better. In other words, the current social assistance system of the Participation Act works worst for the most disadvantaged people. And since the whole social security system is aimed for disadvantaged people, I think that's a pretty terrible result. Interesting, but something should change.
Very interesting. I mean, sad, but very interesting. But so I want to move now because we only have 10 minutes left of our section, so to speak. I want to move to the agency part of Jeanette's talk. So the idea is that we have this sort of simplified, for me this was really an eye-opener. We have a simplified view of agency, and so the basic story is that your perspective on the future gets sort of blurred, and it gets more, it's more focused on the direct here and now, or maybe the near future yes. than the far away future. The more you're sort of, trapped into this poverty system. Is that what is this a fair summary?
I think that, I think that people's horizons close in a bit because They can't see what they can do to improve their situation. So they will be focused on getting through the day, getting through the week, maybe getting through the month, but any longer is kind of pointless because there's nothing they can do about that now. They don't have the resources to do the planning ahead. So I think in that way they are necessarily focused on the near. I think anyone would be.
That's a sort of claim about causality, if you like. So the idea is not that people who are sort of only focused on the near future, those are the people who get poor, but it's because you are poor that you have this particular... So you turn things...
Yeah, well...
Sort of common wisdom upside down.
Yes, I suppose so. Look, there's an empirical question. There are empirical questions here. And of course, I wouldn't want to deny that there are some people who are impulsive and short-term thinkers, and you know that their situation in life may go backwards from a high base because of personal characteristics that aren't very helpful. But I also think that we're wasting a lot of talent in communities that are poor because we're not giving people a chance to develop. We're not giving people a chance to try stuff, to extend themselves, because they don't see it as an option. You know, it's like certain in class systems, and I think we have class systems, you know, that among certain groups, it was unthought. Going to university was not one of your options if you grew up with a certain background. It just wasn't one of your options, so you didn't consider it. You know, it never seemed possible to you. And I think that people who live in poverty, there's a lot of things that don't seem possible to them, often because they are not, unless we manage to sort of raise the baseline.
But I think it's very convincing, your argument. The body of knowledge I used for my thesis, there was literature on the effects of stress, the effects of scarcity, the effects of people going through large bureaucracies, imposing psychological burdens on them. And they all say the same, that it impairs self-control, it impairs long-term planning. So it fits seamlessly with what you've told.
I think there's a lot of evidence of long-term injury from the system. You know, a lot of people find that their mental health problems get worse and worse until they reach the point where they can't work anymore because, you know, they've developed a very serious anxiety disorders or depression. I'm not sure what it's like here, but rates of suicide among people on welfare in Australia are way higher than for any other group, you know, and way higher than their proportion of the population. So there's a lot of hopelessness out there, and sure, you might say, well, people who are depressed and anxious are more likely to be unemployed, but it certainly goes in both directions, and we can't ignore the effects of the system on people's physical and mental health.
So what does all this mean for, say, real life situations? So is it actually the case that your research shows that either giving up on the conditionality of welfare is it sort of costs the society the exact same amount of money as it costs as the sort of punitive system costs? Or is there even maybe, in terms of you know, improving people's well-being, is there maybe even some sort of financial benefit to get from switching to a system in which welfare is not conditional?
Yeah, to do the financials on that is really difficult because how do you calculate more long-term social well-being effects? That you can make some business cases out of it, but it's really a lot of guessing. The problem with all social policy, of almost all social policy, is that the costs sometimes are very clear and you can put them in an Excel sheet, but the benefits are estimates. So what policymakers often do is only look at the cost. But if you ask my opinion on it, but it's difficult to substantiate it with numbers, then yes, there would be ways in which we can design our social system in which it would cost much less money on bureaucracy, and it would, at the very least, have the same results on outcomes. I'm quite confident on that. Yeah.
And positive results on human well-being.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you planning any follow-up studies or longer-term following of people?
We had permission for only 2 years for this experiment, so we did that, and we did another measurement after 3 years to see if there are follow-up effects. We have to analyze it yet, but we can do that. But the positive news in this is that our current Minister of Social Affairs, she is quite positive, and she says she will make it. She will make the policies, the Participation Act, more based on trust. And there will be small changes into what I think is the good direction. She also made it possible that more long-term studies can be conducted. And if any municipalities are there who are willing to do those, I would be extremely interested in the results. But at the moment, as far as I know, there are no follow-up studies planned. But these kind of social experiments in real-life settings, they're extremely expensive and complicated. So it's not something which I can do with my 0.2 FTE at university myself. But I sincerely hope that, especially with more results coming out and those results seeming promising, that some municipalities will say, okay, now we will. Now it's our turn to do an experiment. Would be really interesting.
But the municipality ordered your research.
Yeah.
You delivered.
Yeah.
And now what's being done with it?
The reintegration office which we have, they continued a program with this group coaching approach. Okay. More human focused, where people pick their own targets. So in small ways, it is being continued. But the real big changes in the system really have to come from The Hague, from our central government. And there it's not. I had the impression that it's not purely led by empirical evidence.
Oh, yeah. Many people have that impression. And so is anything like this being done in Australia? I was just wondering.
I don't know of any specific experiments. I think there's been, groups of people pushing the idea of something like a UBI, a universal basic income. But I think most of the efforts are going into trying to make welfare less conditional and raising the income, because, part of the problem is the very, very low level of payments that have actually been recognised. That the work that has been done is on the adequacy of the payments given to people who are looking for work. And they're very inadequate, and all the evidence shows that, in fact, they're so low that they make it harder for people to get a job. They make it harder for people to present themselves for work. They actually just can't meet the expenses of, presenting for a job interview, not being too hungry, all of those sorts of things. So the pressure is to raise the rate of payments. And so there's two sources that pressure's coming from: to raise the rate because the rate is plainly sort of impeding people's opportunities to get work and to participate. And the conditionality is another one that there's a lot of push on at the moment. The rate was raised very slightly in the budget that was just handed down. People are a single person will get an extra $2.85 per day, which is not much, pretty unsatisfactory, but there was some increase to rental assistance. There's some talk about letting people earn more money before it cuts out That's supposed to obviously incentivize work a bit more.
If I may ask, what one of the problems here is that we have the social assistance allowance, which is not enough for a lot of people to live by, but people are allowed or have the opportunity to fill their income with lots of different sources. The municipality has some sources, there are some. So if you're poor, you often have your income from like 15 to 20 different sources, and you have to manage them all, and you have to know what to apply when, and they are all paid at different moments. So it obviously gives people a little more money, but also a lot of stress because you have to manage all of it. And you have the food bank and the clothing bank and those kind of initiatives as well. Does that also work like that in Australia? Or?
There's only one source of income, and that's through the Social Security Department, where you get your pension or you get your dole. And there are, of course, now food banks springing up everywhere because people are going hungry.